we can keep it interactive.
Yes, I have this belief that people questions come to your mind as and when they come, and not necessarily you need to wait for the end. And very few people would probably make a note of the question and wait till the end. So if you have a question and you think is relevant, it'd be great if you ask that question as and when you want. You can raise your hand, you can activate your microphone if you think is something extremely important, or you can use the chat facility. Um, well, the presentation today is very, I mean, I could do this presentation in one slide. The point is that I suggest that strategy as a science or as a discipline is kind of at an end. And why is it at an end? Because it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work in the way it used to be. I would like to believe it works, otherwise I would be left without a job. But on top of that, you will see how I try to weave the argument. The basic point is that in the land of giants we live today, like Amazon and that kind of giants, it's incredibly hard to come up with a business idea that you can develop and even threat these giants. So what I suggest is that the way to compete is slightly different than if you wanted to go head on. So the story is the following. For the people who have come now, if you feel that you want to make a question, please feel free to make a question at any point by raising your hand. And if you feel you're desperate to speak, just activate your microphone and interrupt. I have no problem of you doing so. Okay, so what is the end strategy? Why the end strategy is basically, why is it so hard to compete against what I call these giants, like the ones that you can see on the screen? Obviously, I have drawn these myself, kind of to give you a hint of how they are, but you all know what these companies are, and there are many other giants that perhaps I haven't mentioned now that I will mention towards the end. These companies occupy a big part of the world today, and they, most importantly, they travel across industries, and this traveling across industries that makes it so hard for you to compete against them. You may be relying on the business that you've done for a lifetime, and that business could well be profitable or give you a nice living, but you don't know that if it becomes tempting, any of these giants can come and take it over at a second's notice. So a little bit of history. I've taken this insight from this website InShorts, and it gives you an idea of how big these companies are. Alphabet, who you may not know, but is the headquarters of Google, um, is the revenue of Google. The yearly revenue is $161 billion, which you always say, well, it's similar to a small country, but I wanted to explain to you what small country specifically. Google is the same size as Hungary. Microsoft is the same size as Morocco. And Apple is the same size as Portugal. So you can see that they are significantly big. They are able to have at least the same power that any of these countries can have. Now, let's look at the breakdown of how this revenue is generated. In the case of Google, 70% is advertising. But there are significant other businesses, like the yellow one, which is Google Other. Anything else that Google does goes into that other. 10% of 161 billion is a lot of money still. They also advertise through Google Ads, and there's the Google service from the Google Cloud, which it doesn't surprise you that they earn money by that. I've never paid a single penny for using Google Documents, but they earn money, and they earn money through third parties. So the main insight here is what Google does is they earn very little per transaction times a huge number of people. By doing that, they're able to dominate the world. Microsoft, of course, has a slightly different business model. You can see that Office is still a big chunk of the money they earn. But this, maybe you haven't heard of this, Microsoft Azure, which is as big as Microsoft Office. That is all the cloud business that Microsoft is in. And then Windows is something, and Bing is something. And I bet you didn't know that LinkedIn belongs to Microsoft, and it's the pinkish bit, 5.4%. Also, I don't know how they make money of LinkedIn, because I don't know who pays for LinkedIn. But obviously, some people do. By now, if you're tempted to interrupt, you're welcome to interrupt. The third is our big friend Apple, and I'm talking through an Apple computer now. The big earner is the iPhone, and I bet you all knew that. And surprisingly, the computers are a teeny weeny bit of the businesses. But the growing part of the business is the service. What they're trying to do is turn into everything into you become a member of it. Now, the other two giants, Facebook is surprising because it's, well, two times Sudan. I know Sudan is a small country, but still, 2 times Sudan. And their biggest income comes from Facebook ads. Now, if you ask me, I think they didn't declare the sources of revenue here. They just wanted a big blue pie. And finally, Amazon, which is probably the biggest giant, is the size of Finland. I bet you didn't know that. Finland is a very respectable country, and Amazon is the size of it now. Their biggest source of revenue is the online store, so the retail business. However, it may come to us as a surprise to you that most of the profit don't comes from the retail business. They don't earn much money, or don't earn as much as they could from the retail business. Most of the money they earn is from this yellow bit called AWS, which is the rest of the business Amazon does. For example, if you have an online business and you want to start up, if you have a business that you want to start an online retailing industry, the online retail business, you can buy that package from Amazon, and you can buy that from Amazon World Services. Most of the times you buy online, and there's a basket that you fill in. That's likely to be Amazon who provided that. So what are the traits that I can highlight from this little story? First, these giants happen in the digital world. The digital world is surprising because it has no frontiers. Amazon can move from one industry to another very easily. Second, almost every company has a digital dimension. If you think of what has happened to COVID now, how we've gone into recession, it's basically been the real world that's gone into recession. The digital world hasn't, and the digital dimension of companies hasn't gone either. So that digital dimension is growing more and more for each company. And as I said before, this generates these blurred industry boundaries. It's really hard to distinguish an industry. It's harder to do it now than it was before. Not that before it was easy. Industries have always been a matter of definition. But also, there's this thing that you can copy a business model and apply it to another industry, and there's no copyright on doing that. You can actually, that's what the companies actually do. God, what idea do that? And this is called business model imitation. Now, how can you imitate a business model, for instance, like Amazon? Well, of course you can. Look at what Alibaba did. They did exactly that with a hint of difference in China. And the amount of business model imitation that is going on is huge. So the moment one company comes up with a new business model, they have to grow very, very quickly in order to, using only the first mover advantage as the entry barrier. And that's what happened with Uber, for example, that it grew very quickly. But what's what problem do I have to copy Uber? It's not a big deal. It's getting the IT done, which you can pay for, and then setting up another Uber. But there are so many cars that will be available. So we'll be fighting for the cars that are available. So, and that's the idea of expansive growth. Business model limitation combined with expansive growth and the free-for-all business model creates this world in which competition is very, very hard. It's a winner-takes-all world. And let me go back to this model, which has been taught in strategy courses since the 1980s, that was developed by Michael Porter. Many people don't realize that this model didn't come up of Michael Porter's head in a night of inspiration. Not at all. All these notions are based on industrial organization, which is a part of economics that was developed for, 50 years before Porter transformed the a bit more complex concepts into these concepts. So there's no way that this model is wrong. It's not wrong, and it won't have any flaws. It explains reality very well. However, it has the problem that it shows you how and when you will die. It doesn't show you how to survive. And the biggest threat that the current competition is having is that whatever business you're in, there would be a threat of new entrants all the time. If your business turns out to be a little bit good, there will be new entrants wanting to come and no barriers for them to get to your business. Or the threat of new substitutes, which is actually another example of new entrants. They are things that can replace the product offerings that you currently have. So the biggest threat comes from this notion that anybody can come into your industry. Now, how do you compete? I bet you by now you're very sad and tears are coming out of your eyes, and you don't realize that there are ways to compete. And that's what I'm trying to kind of tease out today. Now, bear in mind that I don't have a whole theory behind it, that I'm not able to throw an equivalent to the Porter's 5 forces on how to compete, but I do have a hunch, and the hunch is pretty well structured. So how do you compete with all these giants? My take is, let me put this example. I hope you like the fox, by the way. It's by a very famous artist that you can see at the bottom. If you look at the fox, and probably if you live in the UK, you've run into foxes many times. Some of you may hate them, some of you may love them. But have you ever wondered what's the long term of a fox? Or what is the strategy of the fox? The fox doesn't have any goal. It's just wanting to survive another day. But surprisingly, by doing that, by surviving another day, is able to be quite resilient. So much so that they're considered to be a pest in some places, and you can find them everywhere. So they are very successful. They have managed to adapt to a world in which we humans have taken everything. So for the foxes, we are the giants. And surprisingly, they are winning the battle against us. They're managing to use our rubbish as food, and then even become more successful than they would have been in the wild. So this may bring to your mind, that's what I'm trying to suggest here. How do we compete? Is a bit like foxes. The foxes trying to fight for their survival. That's what small businesses can do. Now, who are the new entrants for the fox? There could be other animals coming in, but mostly they're in quite a comfortable niche, because we cannot get rid of them, so in their weakness they are very strong. Now, another example, you may think that I'm turning into Attenborough now, but I'm not. I'm just trying to make examples that are appealing to you. What is the long term that a condor has? What is the strategy? What are the giants? Who are the new entrants? It happens that a condor is a very resilient animal.
Ignacio, before we move to the condor, would it be possible to pick up one of the questions we got from Trevor in the chat?
Of course.
About foxes. Trevor, why don't you raise the question yourself? Please go ahead.
I love the analogy, in terms of the animal analogy, Ignacio. I think so. I think if you think about the business life cycle, you know, foxes are constantly at the startup stage. They're constantly just trying to keep their head above water, metaphorically. I think that's very interesting to think about that in terms of small, you know, newly emerging businesses, and particularly small businesses which are trying to rapidly internationalize, for example. So I think it's a.
You're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, do you think that foxes would be constantly at this, using that analogy, they have to constantly think about being at the startup stage in terms of how they operate, in terms of their strategy, at the companies which would be doing that?
Yeah, well, I think that first, in the actual example, if foxes take over, it would be like the planet of the apes or the planet of the foxes. So that might be a difficult situation for us humans. But building on the analogy, of course, there are many companies who remain at the startup level for a long time, and they just carry on subsisting. If you think of, I don't know, the corner shops, for example,
yeah,
they supply a living to many people. Are they extremely successful? Maybe not, but that's probably enough. Now, do you need to become an Amazon? I think that if you start up a business and end up becoming an Amazon, it's a bit like winning the lottery. I don't particularly think that it was the genius of the founder that created Amazon. I think it was a lot of luck and being in the right place in the right time, and being able to adapt whatever they were doing. We have to remember that until 1999, Amazon had never earned a single penny and was just selling books. And then when they realized they could sell everything, that's when the growth began.
Yeah, and maybe in some ways, and I'll let you continue with the presentation, obviously, but I think some ways some of these organizations have had to think in that mindset. So if you think about Amazon has reinvented itself in multiple times in terms of innovation and creativity, and you know they almost constantly have a startup element to their business, which is bringing in additional revenue. So if you think about, you know, the development of the Alexa, and you know how they've become sort of such a multi-channel retailer as well, you know, and it is that mindset where they're constantly looking at going into new niches, new markets, and trying to be, you know, the early adopter, or if not, they're the first to really, if you like, mass market the products. I'm sure they weren't the first to come up with Alexa or that type, but it was probably a small business who didn't have the reach and scope of a company like Amazon, for example, and that's why Amazon were so successful.
Well, surprisingly, one of the objectives of many entrepreneurs today is to get their business bought by Amazon. And many new entrepreneurs start up as working for Amazon, being an entrepreneur for Amazon. For example, Amazon may lend you the money to start up your own business if you prove to be very successful. Now, one could say that Amazon is the fox that outfoxed every other fox, and maybe that's true. But what happens is that when they become giants, they can absorb you and they can outcompete you at any point. Isn't it suspicious, for example, that they are not earning money by their retail business, that they actually lose money by doing it, but in doing so, they're getting rid of all the competitors? That's when it becomes really challenging and threatening, and that's when you feel like the small fox trying to steal the rubbish of the big giant. And that's a bit that I think that that's the people that I think I am speaking to. Those people who are at that situation now can do something by being extremely attuned to the environment. And if you allow me, I will move to the condor, and probably you've had enough time to look at the slides and read what it says. But
Ignacio, there is more discussion going on about the foxes. If Scott would want to come in, and Adam commented on Trevor's point about Alexa, that Amazon bought it from a different inventor. Scott, please come in.
Oh, hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Ignacio, for your wonderful presentation. It's very thought-provoking. I just wanted to throw something in to around the Fox. I mean, the Fox is great because it makes us all start to think in a different way, doesn't it? So I see the Fox as part of an ecology, and as long as the ecology supports its survival, the Fox survives without having to do anything different. It's, as you said, it doesn't have a strategy. It simply survives by virtue of that which is around it, its environment, supporting its continuing survival. We then think about Amazon and the high street retailer. The high street retailers strategies were fine until Amazon has arrived. It's disturbed the ecology. The ecology is forever changed, and those retailers that have failed to have a sufficient strategy have suffered, and more will suffer from it. So I suppose my point to bring you back to your role in life is that strategy remains important in order to understand the ecology that surrounds oneself, and that we need to look to yourself and your colleagues in order to guide us on strategy to make sure that we don't die out in the ecological changes which surround us all. Thank you.
Yeah, I have missed Scott's accurate sense of humor. No, it's not my job to remain strategy, but I do think it hasn't. I mean, I put the name of the end of strategy, but I don't think it has died. I actually think that there's an attitude that has to be redefined in order to have a strategy. Of course, if you are a retailer who sat on their laurels for a long time, yeah, you're gonna die because you're not trying to compete. And this is where this slide that I'm trying to show now, I hope you're able to see it, comes into play. What I am trying to suggest is that the key to keeping up with the environment is being attuned to the environment. And many people use this word of guerrilla war. I want to just tell you a little bit of where this word comes from. It was a word invented in Spain when the French Napoleonic army had conquered Spain. And guerrilla actually means little war. So rather than going head on against the French army, they went little by little in pretty much what you know as guerrilla now.
Pardon,
Guerrilla.
Professor, the slide is not, we can't currently see it.
Oh, that's so bad. Thank you for letting me know. You should be able to see it now. Can you see it now?
We can, thank
Yes,
you.
we can see it.
So that's the explanation of the word guerrilla, which I cannot pronounce because it's not pronounced like that. And that brings me to a paper I wrote on this notion of affordances and habitus. You don't need to know about this because it's very convoluted, but what I'm trying to suggest is that the practice of your business keeps you attuned with your environment. The more attuned you are, the better you are able to compete. And that brings me back to that notion of the corner shop. Yeah, the corner shop will never grow to be an Amazon, but it's extremely attuned to the environment. They know every customer and every good customer, a bad customer that comes in, and they can deal with it. They can even deal with giving them credit because they know each customer. So in order to compete, the must, it's you and your circumstances. And I'm translating that from Spanish as well. It's not just yourself. Adam, you had a question?
No, just backing you up.
Backing me up. Oh, how
Yep.
kind.
It's great now. So really enjoying this. Really interesting.
And to finish, this is my last story, and I'm going to tell you a story that happened yesterday. It was very timely. You may not know these companies, but a company called Salesforce paid £20 billion for a company called Slack. I'm going to tell you a little bit of what these companies do, which is fascinating, and it shows this fact that the business models can be copied and replicated, and there's no harm in doing it. And also, it shows the fact that you can move across industries seamlessly. So, this company called Salesforce is a software giant, and they produce customer relationship management software. That's what they started doing. And this is a gold mine, the way they market. And because if you go to a company and you tell them, look, I'm going to make you sell a lot more by using this software, the company would be willing to pay anything for that software. So that's what Salesforce does. Now, the boss, all these companies have a boss, like a knight in shining armor. And this one is called Mr. Benioff. And he wrote this quote yesterday, saying if Salesforce wants to expand beyond its core gold mine of sales and marketing departments, this was the moment and thus represent a major shot across the bow against Microsoft. Look at this. They're going against Microsoft and they're going head on. He wrote this yesterday. Now, what is Slack? Slack, if you don't know, I think it's a fascinating business. Well, let me point out first that it's a company that has been in existence for about 10 years and has never ever earned a penny. It has lost money for all the time, but still it was worth $20 billion, which is a significant amount of money. What Slack offers is a chat service within your organization. And you may think to yourself, why do we want that? Well, many companies want it because the email is proving to be a dying breed, and people want shorter, snappy communication. So what Slack offers you a ton of services, but it basically offers each individual to be connected to the channels that are relevant to that individual. So I don't know, if we had Slack, which hopefully we won't ever have, because that will give me another thing to look into. That would mean that I would be connected to, I don't know, the teaching and the research of the university due to the ref. So the different jobs I have, I would be connected to different channels, and constantly I would be receiving chats from these channels. Now, surprisingly, this company, a couple of years ago, Microsoft thought of buying it. And they did all the due diligence of the company, and then decided otherwise, which is really cheeky, isn't it? And they, afterwards, all that they would have obtained through buying Slack, they developed it organically in MS Teams. So for all of you who have MS Teams, there is this facility to send chats and to have channels and all that in MS Teams. But obviously what Salesforce is doing is trying to outcompete Microsoft with their MS Teams platform by launching Slack in all the platforms they already have. And that's why they paid this amount of money. Business models can be copied, and there's no punishment for doing so. You can develop a company. I mean, Slack, I don't think it gets more foxy than Slack. They developed a business out of developing software that everybody knows how to do it. I mean, I don't know, of course, but anybody who is a little bit of a computer geek will be able to develop a chat facility. So they developed that, and they started selling it or giving it to companies little by little, and then making these companies value what they do, this alternative way of communicating. And the Fox, after, I don't know, 10 years, was sold for $20 billion. What happens, unfortunately, with many of these entrepreneurs who sell these companies for these fortunes is they don't work anymore. Now, I don't know if I got a 20 billion pound check, would I work again or not? But the temptation is there. But this situation is what generates these giants. And look at this company, Salesforce, a giant, although I didn't mention it at the beginning. But it has become a giant by doing something very simple in a very good way. And I think that's all I have to say. So hopefully you have not, I mean, all the questions haven't dried out, and you still have some interest in asking me stuff. I'd love to hear from you. This is something that I have been thinking of for a while, but I genuinely, I mean, this has no academic rigor, and it's only something that I've been interested in. of course, it has to do with the fact that I published this paper that has to do with the affordances, but this has gone way beyond that. So happy for anybody who wants to ask something to ask.
First of all, thank you, Ignacio, for a really exciting and interesting presentation. And as you say, the floor is really wide open. Great stuff. Thank you from the chat, sir. I think we are getting some questions coming in, and Trevor offers some suggestions. Why don't you come online, Trevor, and say a few words about what you just posted?
I'll leave the floor to others in a moment, but as people know, I like to chat. I watched a fascinating documentary in September, and it's called The Social Dilemma. It's on Netflix, and it focuses on the strategies and monetization of these type of giant, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Intels, etc., and the social media businesses, and also how they control the almost, I hadn't thought of it before Ignacio's presentation, but how they control and really eat up the foxes in their industries, and how they ensure that they become the main source of social media information, etc. So it's really, really well done, and it's really thought-provoking as well in terms of the strategies these type of organizations operate. It's an element almost of insider research, because they've got former executives from many of these organizations who've talked about the strategy and the culture, and really trying to snub out competition as early as they possibly can. So it really segues very well, Ignacio, with the type of what you've done in this presentation. I think it's and I hadn't thought of it in terms of the metaphorical way you had done before. So it really does dovetail very well with your presentation.
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the most striking phenomena is that I don't know, maybe I'm being a millennial at heart, and because I always think that it's easy to think that the world started yesterday, but it is my impression that up to, I don't know, 20 years ago, most big companies like, I don't know, General Motors or DuPont, they wanted to offer a service or a product, and they wanted to earn money in return, which was fair enough, and everybody understood that. But the objective of these giants is not that. It's not to offer a service, and it's not to, earning money is an absolute secondary thing. It's, with all due respect, it's world domination. They want to have a huge influence in how the world develops. And it is a couple of months ago, in the middle of the pandemic, there was this huge hoo-ha in the, I think it was Microsoft who wanted to buy TikTok, because TikTok is a Chinese company, a very successful media company, and they didn't agree on buying it because there's no money that pays for the value that world domination has. So that social element of it is extremely important and significant. I thank you very much for your contribution, Trevor. I really appreciate your words.
And Trevor, in the meantime, has given us some more inspiration for our Christmas shopping on Netflix. But let us bring Adam and Scott in with some more points. Please go ahead.
Ignacio, that was great, and it's so incredibly thought-provoking. Just interesting on the higher education part, you mentioned Salesforce. I've used Salesforce in my businesses for the last 10 years. It is the world leader in what it does of managing sales process and lead generation. What they then realized is the greatest lead generation we needed was students. So now Salesforce has a higher education one that will recruit students to your university. London School of Economics have just signed on, and they're now they have launched it in the UK. In the US, there's about 500 universities already using it. Now, by taking Slack on, they can not only be the recruitment tool, Salesforce stays with the students during their 3 or 4 years. It then links to them getting jobs after uni, but Slack can also then integrate to be the students into relationship with the university education, with each other. And so when he says that they're going after teams in that higher education space, they are now better equipped than Microsoft to actually provide a full service to universities and students. And I think the clever part for them is it's sales driven. They're making money for us, not just providing another service.
Absolutely. And surprisingly, they're not making much money for themselves. That's the thing that breaks the story. They're not there for the money. They're for the world domination. Sorry, I may be using the wrong word. Because once you're able to become a giant, then nobody can harm you.
Now, once we look at Microsoft, the historicness of our laptops have it on, so every year we just repurchase because we're not ready to change. And Google Docs is nowhere near ready to be able to beat off Microsoft. But it'll be interesting to see whether or not Salesforce, who are a much slicker company from an external sales perspective, than a Microsoft.
You see that my analogy of the fox helps. What Salesforce has done is behave like a fox, and in doing so has become a giant now, and a fabulous giant, I think that a lot has to do with many of these companies. I'm going on a limb here, but many of these companies have these greater than life champions that lead the company. That explains a lot of what they do. And they tend to take these decisions that sound mad, but most of the times it works. Now, the times that it doesn't work, they hide it very well.
Well, Slack was started by the same person that started Flickr before that, and Flickr made money, sold early, but there was no real length to it. It's knew that Slack was the next one. You say it's the same people who are able to regurgitate this model that just seems to work. Also, they're very good at reinvesting the large sums of money they've made. You know, 400 million revenue Slack has now for a $20 billion sale is, you know, if it's unheard of.
Now, in the closer to home world, you will all have heard of Dave Cormack. He's the president of Aberdeen Football Club, or the chairman of Aberdeen Football Club, and he's a very close friend of the business school. I interviewed Dave a week ago, and that will come up this Sunday on LinkedIn on the Aberdeen Football Club story. But the story, I mean, his personal story is that I can explain the story in 1 second. He invented, or he outsourced, a software for dentists. Does it get more dull than that? No. And he's a multimillionaire. So you see that the condor and the fox are really, I like the analogy, because it's a skill that you have that may not be particularly cool, but you do that very well. And you do it in a way that you go around outfoxing the fox.
There we go. We got a new supply of questions and comments. Let's move on to Scott and Norman. Scott has a query about the geopolitical dimension of giants strategies, and Norman wonders whether there is a danger of giants over diversifying their portfolio when they buy non-core businesses. Maybe Ignacio, you want to respond directly, or maybe colleagues want to come in and elaborate a bit further?
Well, personally, I'd love to hear Norman or Scott. So if you want to come in, I'd be delighted to hear you. But if you don't, I'm happy to answer as it is.
Ignacio, I really just want to mention that I think I heard a few weeks ago that Sainsbury's, or one of the supermarkets, has pulled out of their banking business. It was non-core, and they felt that it wasn't a success. And I realise Sainsbury's isn't the level of Amazon or Facebook in terms of market value. But if we go from just the level beneath these big giants, you've seen companies expand into their non-core business and get their fingers burnt, and then they sell off maybe 7 or 8 years later. So is the strategy of world domination at a slightly lower level has seen a number of casualties?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I think that there's a slight difference though between the big supermarkets and these other giants, and the difference I see is that the fixed cost of the supermarket really drags them down. Whereas these companies these giants that I'm mentioning, they go into the additional business with little or no investment in fixed costs and with their software and a little bit more. And they only gamble that chunk. They don't gamble the difficult chunk. And perhaps closer to home, building on the notion that that Adam mentioned a second ago, Salesforce wanting to recruit students. It may sound like they're making our life a lot easier because we don't have to do the recruitment, but not. They're taking the fancy part of the business and leaving the boring, dull, and industrious part to us, which is to have the buildings and run it every day and deal with the disgruntled students and teach them and educate them and form them. And nobody's interested in that boring part. On the same note, very few people are interested in selling groceries because it's the real part of the economy, and they just want this fancy part. What I'm sorry to see is that the real part is getting less and less value. In very many, in a similar way, this is going to sound Marxist, but I don't mean it that way. In a similar way as capital and labor, it feels like these giants only play for the fancy bits of capital, and then they leave the boring labor to somebody else. But somebody is doing the labor. I personally think, for example, sorry to move into another business, but in the business of higher education, the transformation that is happening under our feet is huge. And we might need to be aware of that, and how is it playing against us, and how much are we sitting on our laurels and not being foxy enough? So the short answer to the question, yeah, of course you can move into businesses that don't work. And these giants, when they make a mistake, they manage to suppress the press, and it doesn't come anywhere. Only the successes come up in the news, and they manage that very well. But I'm absolutely sure they have made many mistakes. Final thing, in the world of banks, I personally think that these supermarkets that went into banks lost the target, because there are many banks who are being incredibly successful now, playing the game of the digital economy. Most of our students don't go to Lloyd's or TSB or any of those boring brick and mortar banks. They go to other banks that they like and are cool, and they can manage it in the computer. And the banks have a fixed cost, a relationship of fixed cost to revenue very small. Well, I wish I had a solution for that. It's just food for thought.
Oh, thanks, Ignacio. That's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Ignacio, maybe before moving to geopolitical dimensions of giant strategies, Adam asked a question whether Tesla would be a good example of a fox.
Well, Tesla is a very strange case because they're playing with the real world. You see that Tesla is, and generally, what's the name of the owner? I am so old, I forget names. Well, the guy,
Elon Musk, yeah.
That guy, who looks like an ET, but well, he manages to make money out of boring, basic stuff. It was a month ago that they launched the new rocket that arrived in the space station, and it was financed by him, of course, paid by NASA. I think what Elon Musk does very well is manages networks extremely well. With Tesla, they have been saying that they're about to go bust for the last year, and maybe they will. But even if they go bust, and surprisingly, I think Elon Musk is the richest person in the world now, which I don't think it makes sense. But if Tesla were to go bust, it would definitely have somebody to take over. The story of the automobile industry is full of companies that have gone bust and then resuscitated. The surprising story of Daimler and Benz is incredible, because Benz was the boring guy who made crappy cars, But Daimler was the guy who made the best cars, but made no money. And only when they went together, they managed to succeed. So I'm not sure Tesla is a good example of a fox. I think Tesla, in my view, it would be more like the condor that does one thing well and insists on that, but maybe I'm wrong.
Can I?
Thanks for that. Go ahead.
Hi, I've switched on my rhetorical library to compete with Martin's larger library in his background. But let me move on to geopolitics, which is much more interesting. I suppose what I was thinking about, Ignacio, was that, you know, these giants, they're all competing across the international aspects. So they're in multiple places. And of course, they're regulated in multiple places, but part of their advantage is their, as I see it, is their ability to be less regulated than some others, and in particular when it comes to things like paying tax. So if one thinks about Amazon making a very small amount of money, a very small margin, they're only able to do that by virtue of having a lower tax rate, by virtue of not being resident in the relevant countries. And of course, countries are seeing less and less revenue from taxation from their larger companies as a result of this, and are struggling with this. And we see Europe in particular, or European countries, trying to start to say, well, we're going to put a different tax system on online businesses to try and level this up, which is then challenged at the geopolitical level. So on the suggestion of this, we then had Donald Trump saying, well, this is an outrage, it's an attack on American businesses. If you put any taxes on our businesses, we're going to put tariffs on your businesses. And so I see these giants operating at a geopolitical level in order to gain continuing competitive advantage, which squeezes out those that are more local and more locally regulated and taxed. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I think you're absolutely right. But there's one thing that the press doesn't tell you, that this tax situation has always existed. Ford, operating in the UK, didn't pay taxes. Well, didn't pay as much taxes as they would have paid in the US, and so on. The story is very old. What happens is that it's very convenient for the politicians to hit the straw man. Did I use that correctly? Because everyone is so close to Google. You Google everything every day. So it's very easy to say, look, Google is this astonishing, greedy company that doesn't pay taxes. I think, with all due respect, I think the press uses the same argument against the Queen for not paying taxes. And they end up paying voluntary taxes. That's one edge to it. Now, as I said at the beginning, I think the ultimate goal is world domination. That's what they want to do, rather than earning money, is the power. And it's surprising because the US has been kind of the dwindling giant, or the empire that is crumbling, but it's not. Most of the businesses that dominate the world come from there. And although Trump is a very strange individual, any US president would have said the same, because they would be protecting their own by far. Now, what I think the obligation of the governments, especially in Europe, is to demand that these companies pay a decent amount of tax, whether it's voluntary or not. And they're on their right wanting to do that, because they make earnings out of this country. Now, is there a solution about that? No, that's a matter of power, and who has more power, and how will they battle for it? Is that a decent question, a decent answer, Scott? Or did I open more questions than answers, that give you answers?
No, I think you introduced the historical dimension, which is always important to recognise in these things, that they're often the things are not so new. And I suppose in some sense I was pointing towards that myself. And if I think about Standard Oil in the 19th and early 20th century, which was dominant in the US oil sector. Ultimately, it had to be broken up through antitrust legislation in order to create competition. So understanding that we have the new Standard Oils, but they're not just American, they're across the globe, and then challenging the effects of that and saying, well, how do we break that up in order to enable greater competition and in order to level the playing field? One of the ways of doing that is leveling the tax playing field. But I agree with you, absolutely, it's a geopolitical question as to whether Europe has sufficient power and indeed dedication to do this, even in the face of geopolitical threats from elsewhere. That's really where I was going with this, that there is an overriding geopolitical dimension to this, which I think sometimes gets missed out by strategy analysis, because it feels like it's in a different plane, but actually these giants are very much operating in this geopolitical sphere primarily, because without it, they can't do what they're doing. Local businesses are different because they're only where they are and take the regulation for granted. And that Amazon in particular, I agree with you with Google, but Amazon in particular as a seller of goods, its margins are dependent on its costs, and one of its costs is the tax rate, and that's where the margin is, the marginal difference. So thank you for your answer. I really
but the only the only defense that the local business has, and that was my point, is to act like a fox against these giants until there's a better environment. There's another question by G.
Well, yes, G would appreciate, you were quite open about how much of this is based in sound theorizing. G suggests, could we at least touch upon theoretical implications?
Would you like
Go ahead, sir. Final thoughts, sir.
Yeah. Would you like to come in, G, or would you like me to answer the note that you left? I'll take it that you want to answer.
Okay. I will be great to hear some of the short answer. Yeah, and then okay. I will walk in to talk to you face to face. Yeah.
Perfect. We have about 5 minutes. Go ahead.
I think it's a lovely way to finish the presentation today. The short answer is I haven't got a clue. No, of course there are a bit more answers than that. I think there's quite a bit of theory that we could use from things that are not industrial organization that would help us understand how these things work. But I would encourage researchers to go back to price differentiation, to monopolistic behavior, because that is what is explaining the behavior that giants have today. So in the ideal world, if somebody could revisit industrial organization and come up with a revised, or perhaps another model to try to understand how you compete with giants in the digital world, that'd be great. Because basically that's what they do. They're using techniques of, for example, price differentiation. When I explained this, that they go and don't earn money with the business, that was basically going so low that they can outcompete everybody in the long run. And becoming big is just monopolistic behavior. So I think the theoretical underpinnings would go along those lines. Thank you very much for the question, G. That was very clever.
Thank you.
I think we have just about time for another question. If anyone would like to come forward, now is the opportunity. It seems we are nearly there, Ignacio. Maybe I ask a question about the giant's lifetime, in your opinion. They
that's very interesting.
They come and go. We heard stories about David and Goliath outfoxing the fox.
Yeah,
where are you on that?
That's very clever, Martin. Thank you for asking that. It may seem like these giants exist today and they've never existed before, but it will be especially important for those of you who are British or from the Commonwealth, that you will remember companies like ICI or the West India Company that were humongous giants in its time, and they actually dominated the world. And for the younger people that are in this talk, you will not even remember who they are. And they dominated the world not that long ago. My mom worked for ICI, so it's not that, it wasn't in the Middle Ages. And they disappeared because the structure disappeared. When the structure changes, structural changes bring about huge changes in how these giants behave. And the giants, the bigger they become, the lazier they become. And it's a lot harder for them to react. And I'm absolutely sure there's somebody there who's coming up in their garage with a new business that would be this device that would make us fly. I'm making this up, I don't know. That would make us fly or being able to teletransport or something as clever as that. And we would be really impressed by that. And that would change all the structure. The moment we're able to change how things move, that will be a change as significant as the internet. That's my guess, but I won't be alive by then, or I will be happily retired.
Wonderful. Final words, Ignacio. There is more discussion happening in the chat. I see Scott has been around for a little longer than pointers to the British East India Company. I'm sure there's more in there for fruitful discussion after the seminar. For now, let me thank you, Ignacio, and all members of the audience for such an engaging discussion over the past hour. Have a great remainder of the day and looking forward to doing this soon again. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ignacio. That was great.
Thanks all. That was a good session. Much appreciated.